Okay, today's daf is Ayin Tet. We are going to start on Ayin Chet Amud Bet with the new Mishnah. Charitz sheben shetei chatzerot amok yud v'rochav daled. So it says, if you have two chatzerot and dividing them instead of a wall, is you have a ditch. And the ditch is full of whatever. Okay, but it's 10 tefachim deep and it's 4 tefachim wide. So it's a significant ditch. So me'arvin shenayim ve'in ma'arvin echad. So this is enough to divide the two chatzerot. They cannot join as one chatzer because they have a ditch in between. Okay. Now, however, it says if malek kash oteven, afilo malek kash oteven, even if you fill the ditch with stubble or straw, that's not considered a permanent change because they might take the straw out. They might use the straw for animal food. So it's still, we see a gap between the two chatzerot. They cannot make an eruvei chatzerot together. Now, male afarot tzrorot, ma'arvin echad ve'en ma'arvin shenayim. But if you fill the ditch with dirt, or you fill it with rocks, pebbles, so now it's considered that you leveled it. And you can, now you can unite the two chatzerot. Okay? That makes sense. Now, Natan alav neser sherachav arba tefachim. Let's say you put a 4 tefach wide board across the ditch. So you have a bridge. Okay? It's not the sturdiest bridge, but it's a bridge. So, and it reaches across. So, and it's wide enough that people will feel comfortable walking over. So that can also unite the chatzerot if you have a bridge. V'chen. Shete gezuz traot zo keneged zo. If you have 2 balconies facing each other, okay, ma'arvin shenayim ve'imratzu ma'arvin echad. They can either be separate and independent, or they can unite with one another. They can unite with one another. Pachot mikad ma'arvin shenayim ve'en ma'arvin echad. If they are less than this, then they have to be separated. So in other words, if you have the 2 balconies and they have a bridge going over them, and the bridge is a 4 tef, you have 2 balconies, they both are hanging off into the public domain. So you want one apart, let's say one building and your building. So these 2 buildings, they want to join together in an eruvei chatzerot so they can carry from building to building. Okay, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to move stuff from one building to we're assuming that their courtyard does not have an eruvei chatzerot. They just want to have a connection. So they can pass things from one house to the other or something like that. So what they can do is, if they have a bridge going across, and it's a bridge of a board, so now they have the option. He says, so now they have the, ma'arvin shenayim ve'imratzu ma'arvin echad. They can either stay independent and say, we don't care about the bridge, we want to do our own thing, or they can unite. Pachot mikan. However, if it's less than this, and in other words, if the board is too thin, then ma'arvin shenayim ve'en ma'arvin echad. In other words, then they can only be separate. That's not having just a 1 by 2 going across. People are not going to walk on that from one building to the other. They're not going to walk on that from one side of the ditch to the other. They're not doing the trapeze. They're not the tightrope walkers. They don't want to do that. So if there's a wide board going from one balcony to the other, or one side of the ditch to the other, now it opens up the possibility that we could unite these 2 chatzerot, or the 2 buildings. Now the Gemara says, v'teben lo hayitz. Is it true that if you fill the ditch with straw, that's not considered a filling the ditch? Because it says in the Mishnah that it's not considered filling the ditch. But we learned we learned that if there's a pile basically of straw, there's a straw house. Now the straw house doesn't have walls, it just has a roof and poles, and it's filled with straw. So we learned that if it's 10 tefachim high, that divides between the 2 chatzerot, the 2 courtyards. So you see that putting the straw there is considered to change the situation. So why don't we also say that filling the ditch with straw should change the situation, flatten the ground? The answer is, Amar Abaye answers, Le'inyan mechitza kulei alma lo peligei dehavya mechitza. Everybody agrees with regard to mechitza. When you're making a wall, the fact is there's something blocking you. You can't pass through. It's straw, whatever it is, it's a wall. Okay, however, aval inyan chatzitza, batle chayetz, v'lo batle lo chayetz. But if you're talking about filling up a ditch, we need to know the intention of the person. In other words, a wall, it's functional. Right now, there's a wall, functionally speaking, separating the two chatzerot. And we know that you can use kelim, you can use anything to make a wall. According to halakha, you can use all kinds of makeshift things, even people. You can use a person to make a wall. You can anything that functions to stop passage in and out is a wall. So straw also. But filling a ditch, if we suspect that you put straw in the ditch, but maybe you're going to empty it out because you're going to use the straw to feed your animals. Straw. Hay. Yeah.
Something that you don't see it.
Tevin. Yeah. So it's called tevin here. So if you put the straw into the ditch, we don't know what you're going to do with it. Maybe it's not going to stay there. So that's why, unless he specifically says, I'm leaving this here permanently, I'm never going to take it, that's called bitul. He has to say, I'm nullifying it. Then it would be closing the ditch. But otherwise, we think that maybe he's going to take it out again. Now the Gemara says, Malay Afar, what if you filled it with dirt, if you filled it with earth, Vafilu bistama, even if you didn't say anything. In other words, with straw, you have to say, I'm leaving the straw here forever. With dirt, you don't have to say anything. If you fill the ditch with dust, with dirt, we assume it's going to stay there. So the Gemara says, V'atanan, but we learned in the Mishnah, Ba'it shemilahu teven otzrorot ubitlo batel. Okay, we learned in a Mishnah that if you fill a house with teven, with straw, or you fill it with rocks, and you nullify it, it's batel. Okay? Bitlo in, and we turn to ayin tet amud aleph, lo bitlo lo, implying that with rocks, with pebbles, you have to explicitly say, I'm leaving these pebbles here, just like but it says in our Mishnah that with the dirt and pebbles, you don't have to say anything. Just fill the ditch, it's enough. In this Mishnah it says that if you fill a house with straw or with pebbles, you have to say that you're leaving it there permanently for it to take effect. Now, what's the case in the Mishnah? The case in the Mishnah is of tumat met. If you have a dead body in a house, and the house is totally full to its ceiling with dirt, or with, let's say like a house collapses, God forbid, and people are trapped. Okay? So there's no airspace. There has to be, if there's a tefach of airspace, then the entire inside of the house could become tameh, but the tumah won't go out. If there's no airspace at all, it's completely full of rubble. Okay? Now the tumah goes up. It goes out. It's squeezed out, so to speak. So it tells us that if the house is full of pebbles, that's considered being full. Okay? But you have to say, I want to leave the pebbles here. You have to say bitul. You have to say, I'm leaving the pebbles. So why is it different? Why with the ditch do we learn that the pebbles you don't have to say anything? Fill the ditch with pebbles and it's done. But when it comes to the house, even if it's filled with pebbles, you have to say, I'm leaving the pebbles. I'm nullifying them. Amar Ravuna says, Mantana Aholot. Who is the one that taught the Mishnah on Aholot, the Mishnah about Tumat Met? Rabbi Yosehi. It must be Rabbi Yosei. But the problem is, but we learn the exact opposite from Rabbi Yosei. Because it says in the Braita, Rabbi Yosei Omer, Teven ve'en atid lefanoto, harihu kistam afar, ubatel. Afar v'atid lefanoto, harihu kistam teven velo batel. Because Rabbi Yosei said the opposite. He said, when it comes to dirt, stam, you didn't say anything, we assume you're leaving it there forever. When it comes to straw, stam, we assume you're going to remove it because you're going to use it for animal feed. So that's why I said, if it's straw, if the house is filled with straw to the top, and you say ve'en atid lefanoto, and you don't plan on removing it, you say I'm never going to remove it, then it's like stam afar. It's like dirt without saying anything. Meaning to say that when you don't say anything, if it's filled with dirt, that's enough. When it's filled with straw, you have to say that you're leaving it there. And the reverse is true. If it's filled with dirt, but you say, I'm going to remove that dirt, now it becomes like teven, like straw, and we assume you're going to remove it. But what do you see from there? You see that stam afar, and we would assume stam tzirorot, pebbles and dirt. You don't have to, according to Rabbi Yosei, you don't have to say anything. So he can't be the author of the Mishnah in Aholot, because the Mishnah in Aholot says that you don't have to say anything for pebbles. I'm sorry, that you have to say something. You have to nullify the pebbles and say that you're going to leave them there. Rabbi Yosei says you don't have to say anything. Now, incidentally, why did the Gemara even suggest that it was Rabbi Yosei if it's obvious that he says the opposite? So Rashi says because they wanted to bring this whole piece in. In other words, they knew that he talked about this case. So it strengthens their point on the other side, that the Rabbanan say that you do have to nullify the pebbles. Only Rabbi Yosei says you don't. Ela Amar Rabasi says, Mantana Eruvin Rabbi Yosei. Simple solution. Who is the author of our Mishnah? Our Mishnah says what? That you don't have to say anything if you fill the ditch with dirt or you fill it with pebbles. That was Rabbi Yosei. Rabbi Yosei is the one that says if a person puts dirt or they put pebbles, we assume they're planning on leaving them there. However, the rabbis would disagree. Rav Huna B'rei Rav Yoshua Amar Rav Huna B'rei Rav Yoshua says, Tum'a Ashabat Karamit. You are comparing Hilchot Tum'ah to Hilchot Shabbat. That's a mistake. Why are you comparing impurity to the case of Shabbat? Hanach Isur Shabbat Tafilu Arnaki Nami Mivatel Inish. On Shabbat, even a bag of money is a person leaves alone because of Muktzeh. So too here. The rabbis might say like this: when it comes to Tum'ah, the house is full of dirt or the house is full of rocks, pebbles. So in Tum'ah, you have to say something. You have to say, I'm leaving the dirt or the pebbles. On Shabbat, the ditch is full of dirt or full of pebbles. You don't have to say anything. Why don't you have to say anything? Why don't you have to say anything? Because it's Shabbat. You can't touch it. You can't touch the dirt. You can't touch the pebbles. It's Muktzeh. So it's a simple answer. It is batel, but it's not your choice. Okay, Rav Ashi Amar, Bayit Acharitz Karamit. I'm going to differentiate between the two cases on a different basis. Not based on Shabbat versus purity and impurity, but based on the context. One is a ditch, one is a house. Bishlam Acharitz Limitaimekae. We understand. A ditch, you're likely to fill it. So if you fill it with pebbles or you fill it with dirt, probably you're planning on leaving it there. However, a house, Elabayit limitaimekae. Are you going to tell me that a house full of dust or pebbles, you're going to leave it that way? The assumption would be you're not going to leave it that way, because who's going to leave their house filled with dirt or pebbles up to the ceiling? So therefore, in the case of a ditch, our presumption is you're leaving it there. In the case of a house, our presumption, unless you say the otherwise, is you're not leaving it there. Okay, so that's the distinction between the two cases. Really, they're not disagreeing. They're really agreeing, but they're two different contexts, and therefore two different answers. So now the Gemara says, Natan alav neser sherochav dalid. We said that if you have the ditch between the two chatzerot, and you put a board that's 4 tefachim wide, you can remedy the situation. You make a bridge. Amar Rav Rava says, Lo sharu ela shenatan lerochbo. That's true if you put the board across the width of the ditch. In other words, you made it a bridge. That's uniting the two chatzerot. But actually, if you put the board by the length of the ditch, in other words, you didn't put it across the ditch, but you put it along the ditch, and you put it along the ditch, then it doesn't matter how wide the board is. Why? Because now the ditch will no longer be 4 tefachim wide. You diminished the width of the ditch by putting even a little bit. In other words, if the board goes along the entire ditch, okay, and it is even a 1x2, even a very thin board, but it goes along and it just covers over a little bit of the ditch. Since the ditch before was exactly 4 tefachim wide, now it's less than 4 tefachim wide. It's not going to be significant anymore. So you actually accomplish uniting the chatzerot not by making a bridge across the ditch, but by diminishing the width of the ditch, because you put the board hanging over the side of the ditch, not across the ditch, so to speak, but along the side, just to make the dimensions of it smaller. That's another way to do it. Right? Because you lessen the width. 2 balconies facing each other, you can make a bridge across them. He says when we're talking about them being exactly parallel to one another, okay, if if they're not directly across from one another, it's no good. And similarly, if you have 3 tefachim in between the 2 balconies, these balconies jut out from their buildings. But if they're within 3 tefachim of one another, but if the distance between the 2, okay, is less than 3 tefachim, we look at it all as one extended balcony. We don't look at it anymore as separate because they're within 3 tefachim of one another. So even though they're 2 buildings, the fact is that they're close enough to each other that there's less than 3 tefachim in between. You don't even need a bridge across. That's the way Rashi seems to understand it. There are some people who say that that this is talking about if they're out of sync with each other, less than 3 tefachim. In other words, if they're not evenly lined up, one is a little bit to the right, one is a little bit to the left, but there's less than 3 tefachim in between, okay? So then if you make a bridge across, we can still accept it because it's akuma. We look at it as a curved balcony. We're uniting it on an angle, but the angle is still small enough that we're able to unite the 2 balconies that way. The new Mishnah says, matben sheben shtei chatzerot kavo 10 tefachim marvin shnayim ben marvin echad. If you have a matben, and again the matben is basically a roof with nothing, no walls, just filled with straw. So it's got 4 poles, let's say, a roof, and straw inside. In between 2 chatzerot, and it divides between the 2 chatzerot because the straw is 10 tefachim high. Okay? So that separates 2 chatzerot. Elo machilin mikan ve'elo machilin mikan. Now, the people who live in one chatzer are allowed to take from the straw on Shabbat and feed their animals. And the people who live on the other side of the teven, of the straw, can take from the straw and feed their animals, even though they live in 2 different chatzerot, and they're taking from the same pile. One is taking from their side of the pile, one is taking from the other side of the pile, no problem. However, if they lower the teven, and now the pile of straw is less than 10 tefachim high, what happens? Now the 2 chatzerot are united, and they have to make an eruvei chatzerot together. They can't separate anymore, because that teven wall that was separating them is now diminished. It's lower than 10 tefachim, and they now have no choice but to be together. Now the Gemara says, as long as the person doesn't take straw into a basket, into a container, and feed his animal. In other words, he can bring his animal to eat. The person in Chatzer Aleph can bring his animal to eat from the straw on their side. And the person in Chatzer Bet can bring his animal to eat from the straw on that side. But he cannot take the straw and put it into his container. Okay? So the Gemara asks, Ul okmei sharei. But you can allow, that implies that you can allow your animal to stand on the straw and eat. But Rav Huna said that Rabbi Chanina said, Ma'amid adam et behemto al gabei asavim b'Shabbat, ve'en ma'amid adam et behemto al gabei muktzeh b'Shabbat. But didn't we say that a person can bring his animal and stand them on grass to graze on Shabbat? That's okay. Why? Because we're not concerned that you, a Jew, are going to pull grass out of the ground on Shabbat. You know you're not allowed to do that. Your animal, fine, but you're not going to do it. But you can't bring your animal and make it stand on muktzeh on Shabbat. Because if it stands on muktzeh, you might touch the muktzeh, because you don't take it as seriously as pulling grass out of the ground. You know it's deoraita. But
what would be the muktzeh?
The straw. It's muktzeh because it's making a wall. It's part of the wall. Part of the divider, so and it was placed there, so you can't touch it. Now, the answer is you can bring your animal and you can stand there and let the animal walk over and eat from the straw. Don't touch it at all. Okay? Is it really true that the straw is muktzeh? You can't put it into your basket? Is that really true? But we learned in a braita that if you have a house in between 2 chatzerot and you filled it with straw, so that divides between the 2 chatzerot, they cannot unite anymore. But here it says the person from Chatzer Aleph can take straw and put it into his container, and the person in the other chatzer can also take and put it into his container. If the wall of straw gets lowered, now the 2 are connected. Now the 2 chatzerot are connected. Ketzad will say, what should he do? No elet betom mevatel rishuto, hu asur v'chavero mutar. V'chen ata omer begov shel teven sheben bet techumei Shabbat. Now what does it say? What it's talking about here is that you have two houses. So let's see if it has a picture actually, because it's easier to describe this with a picture. But basically, in the chatzer, you have two houses. You have in between the here we go.
Which one?
Number 273. So you have between the two houses, you have a chatzer here, and you have a chatzer here. Okay, now the teven is in the middle, the straw is in the middle. See that?
Yeah.
Okay, now it opens on one side to a particular person's house. This guy has a door, and this guy has a door. Okay? So a particular person has access to a room that leads to the teven, and a particular person on this side has access to the room that leads to the teven. So what can he do? That guy from this chatzer can say, you know what, I'm going to lock my door. I'm going to lock the door that goes into the teven, and I'm going to be mivatel. I'm going to give up my rights to the teven, and now the guy on the other side from the other chatzer can take it. But if they both share it, then you have a problem. Because since now there's no division between the two chatzerot, because the teven went to a low level, it's no longer separating the two chatzerot. The two chatzerot are connected. One of them has to give up his rights to it to the other one. Otherwise, they're sharing the teven between the two chatzerot, and nobody's allowed to use it at all. It's going to be a shared place. They can't have a shared place. So what they could do is these people can give up their rights, or this person can give up his rights. He can close his door, lock his door, give up his rights to the teven. Now this gets transferred to this chatzer. Fine, this belongs to this chatzer, and they still have a dividing wall. Okay, but otherwise they're going to be sharing this area, and nobody can take the teven if they both share it. Okay, that's what the picture is depicting. So, however, what do you see from here? Oh, and the same rule applies to a ditch of straw between two techumin. In other words, one city, its 2,000 amat techum ends at half of the straw ditch. And one city, its 2,000 amat techum ends on the other side of it. Okay? So what happens is that they are allowed to take, each one is allowed to take from their side, but not from the other side. So, but the point here is, Katani Mihad, we learn, it says clearly that each person is allowed.
What's the problem? They can share both of them. It's even.
Yeah, but sharing is not allowed unless you have an Eruvin Chatzerot. That's the problem. So when the teven is so high that it makes a wall, so then they're considered to have separate halves. Your side is your side, my side is my side. But once it lowers beneath 10 tefachim, it's all one. And so now the people from the other chatzer and the people from this chatzer are sharing this, and they didn't make an Eruvin Chatzerot. So they can't have a shared property without Eruvin Chatzerot.
The wall doesn't go up to the end.
Right, the wall doesn't go up to the end. That's the problem. So, exactly. Or if the teven were the entire length of the chatzer, it would also be, but it's more realistic to think it's only one part of it. Now, but the point is that it says there that each side can take and put into their basket. So why are you telling me they can't put into their basket? Why? Right, but it says here that they can. So what does he say? So they say, so amre bayit kevandika tikra ki mifchit min karale milta achalo min karale milta. The real problem here is, okay, so there are two interpretations of why you can't handle the straw that Rashi brings. Interpretation number one is what I mentioned, that it's muktzeh. But what's muktzeh really? Only the lower 10 tefachim of the pile. Why? Because that's the part that's making the wall. But if you take from higher, it's okay. Now, in a house, when you have a roof, you can tell where you are on the pile. Right? When the pile gets lower, you can tell. Outside, the case where it said you can't put it into your basket is talking about where it's outside. There's no roof. So you can't tell when it's gotten lower, when you're beneath 10 tefachim and when you're above 10 tefachim. You can't easily tell because you don't have a roof to be a benchmark. When you have a benchmark, you're allowed to. That's one interpretation in Rashi. The other interpretation in Rashi is that the reason why you can't take straw is not because of muktzeh, but because we're worried that you're going to diminish the wall without realizing it. So inside the house, when you have a roof, we're not worried about that because you're going to be able to tell when it gets too low. Outside, if a wall of straw is separating you and you don't have a roof, we're worried that you're going to diminish the wall without realizing it. So the issue is whether Rashi says either it's about diminishing the wall, or the problem is muktzeh because the straw is part of the wall. One of the two possibilities. Okay. In either case, the roof will help you. It will help you tell which is the higher part of the pile that you're allowed to take from, or the lower part, according to the side that the issue is about muktzeh. And if the issue is not about muktzeh, the issue is just about making sure that you know if the pile is too low. Also, the roof will help you tell whether the pile is too low. So now, so it says if the pile of straw gets lower than 10 tefachim, now you have a problem. So, ha-asara sharei. So what the implication is that even if the ceiling is 20 tefachim high, and remember it has no walls, but the straw is 10 tefachim high, that's enough. We don't care that the straw has to reach the ceiling. So what do you see from that? You see from this that even if walls don't reach the ceiling, they're still good. How do you see that? Because maybe the pile of tevin is 10 tefachim, but maybe the roof in that shed or whatever it is 20 tefachim. So it doesn't matter. And that contradicts something we learned in the previous perek, that there was an opinion that walls that don't reach the ceiling are not walls. So why don't they see obviously from here that even though the tevin might not reach the ceiling, it's still wall? The answer is, we're talking about a tevin house. We're talking about a shed that is a little bit less than 13 tefachim tall. A little bit less. So what turns out? V'tevin asara. And since the straw is 10 tefachim tall, okay, it's within 3 tefachim of the ceiling, that's enough. But anything more than that wouldn't necessarily be good, because when it's within 3 tefachim of the ceiling, we say it's like it reaches the ceiling anyway. But more than 3 tefachim wouldn't be good. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, says, "Afilu tema babayit asara." We could even say that the shed roof is only 10 tefachim tall, v'teven shiva u'mashu, and we could say that the straw is actually 7 and a little bit more. It comes out to the same. It's less than 3 tefachim from the ceiling. Because anything that is less than 3 tefachim apart is considered connected. Now Abaye has a proof for his position, because Abaye can look at the Mishnah. What does the Mishnah say? That the straw is 10. So he says the roof could be up to almost 13. Because it says in the Mishnah it's 10. The straw is 10. But according to Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, how does he account for the Mishnah? The Mishnah doesn't say it could be 7. It says it could be 10. It needs to be 10. So how does he explain the 10? He says mitorat asara. What it means is halachically it's looked at as 10. Why is it halachically looked at as 10? Because 7 and a little bit more, with a space of less than 3 tefachim to the roof, is considered 10. So according to him, you don't need to have 10 tefachim of actual straw. You just need to have a halachic 10 tefachim, including the roof. According to Abaye, we're talking about where you had 10 tefachim of straw and less than 3 tefachim from there to the roof. Shnei masurin. If the pile of straw becomes nitma'et, it becomes diminished on Shabbat, now both sides are prohibited, because now the chatzerot unwittingly have become one chatzer. They no longer have the division. Let's say this house of straw was 10 amot long. So therefore, diminishing it means that there's an opening in the wall between the two chatzerot that is 10 more than 10 amot. So now they're considered one. There's a breach in the wall. There's nothing separating them. So it says they become one chatzer. So Shema Minad Diurina Ba'in B'Shabbat Asurin. What do you see from this? That even though they made an Eruvei Chatz, even that the status of chatzerot on Erev Shabbat does not establish their status for the entire Shabbat. In other words, if you have a chatzer that made an Eruvei Chatzerot before Shabbat, but additional people show up on Shabbat, that ruins the Eruvei Chatzerot, because they weren't included before. Even though on Erev Shabbat they weren't there, we don't care. On Shabbat itself, they're there. And because what do you see here? You diminish the straw on Shabbat itself, and now all of a sudden, 2 Chatzerot become 1 Chatzer. The Gemara answers no. Dilma de imat me'etmol. Maybe it's talking about where the straw became diminished yesterday. It never says it became diminished on Shabbat. It just says, keep your eye on that straw during the week. Because it could be that one Friday you're going to look and it's going to be less than 10 tefachim. And that means that the 2 chatzerot are really 1, and they need to either fill in the straw, or they need to make an eruvei chatzerot between the 2 of them. It says that when you have a situation where the teven, the straw, has reached a level that's lower than 10 tefachim, but it's in between these 2 individual houses which share a chatzer, okay? So the guy who has the door into the straw house, he closes his door, locks his door, and he gives it up to the other chatzer. So it says, Tarte, he has to do 2 things. Why should he have to lock his door and also do bitul reshut? Why do you need to? Hachi kamar, what it means is, oh no, elet beto, oh mivatelet reshuto. What it means is he has to do either one or the other. Either he locks his door, in other words, sealing off the one chatzer's access to the teven, so now the other chatzer can use it, or he gives up the reshut. He doesn't have to do both. The ibaitema, alternatively, leolam tarte. Really, he needs 2. Kevan de dashbe ate litaltule. Since the person is so accustomed to going through the door to take straw, even if he says, I'm giving up my rights, I'm mivatel reshut, it doesn't matter. Because he's so used to doing it, he's going to walk in and he's going to take the straw on Shabbat. So he has to lock his door and give up reshut, give up his rights. And Rashi says that according to this view, that would be true for all bitul reshut. Whenever somebody gives up their rights to a certain area, they have to lock their access to that area so they don't forget and use it on Shabbat. It emphasizes the person who gives up his rights is not allowed to use that teven place, the place with straw, but the other guy is allowed. So why does it have to mention it? Pshita, that's obvious. It's to teach you about a case where the person in Chatzer number 1 gives up his rights to the person in Chatzer number 2. Then the person in Chatzer number 2 feels bad. So he goes back and gives up his rights and locks his door for the person in Chatzer number 1. So they keep switching back and forth. Kamash Malan, what do you learn from here? De'en mevatlin v'chozrin mevatlin, you can't do that. 1 bitul per Shabbat. You can't have them going back and forth, back and forth. So once the person in Chatzer number 1 gives up his rights to the person in Chatzer number 2, that's it for that Shabbat. Okay. Then we talked about we said in the Baraita that if you have a pile of straw in between 2 Techumei Shabbat, one city's Techum reaches the middle of the straw pile. The other city's Techum reaches the other half of the, whatever it is, the cave full of straw, whatever it is. So the people from city A can only take from their half. The people from city B can take from their half. So the Gemara says, Pshita, that's obvious. What's the chidush? It's within their techum, so what's the problem? So the answer is that lo tzichal Rabbi Akiva. It's necessary for Rabbi Akiva. Why? Da'amar techum in deoraita. Because according to Rabbi Akiva, the whole concept of techum is actually deoraita. And the concern is that if we allow somebody, according to Rabbi Akiva, that techumin are deoraita, so it's very strict. You can't take something outside your techum. Maybe we'll be worried. Half of this pile of straw is outside my techum. Only half of it is within. And on the other side, only half of it is within, half of it is without. So maybe we should make a gezerah. Maybe we should make a decree. You can't take even from your half. Because since it's all one pile of straw, we have to be worried, maybe you're going to take from the side that's not yours, that's not within your techum. Kamash Malan, it comes to tell you that we do not make such a gezerah. We allow you to take from your half. Even according to Rabbi Akiva, who's very strict about techumin, we still allow you. The new Mishnah says, Ketad mishtatfin b'mavoi. How do you connect a mavoi? You have two chatzerot, they open to the same alley, the same mavoi. They want to make an eruvei, they want to make a shitufei mavoot. So meniach et chavit ve'omer. He should put down a barrel of food. Okay, if he wants to. Let's say the one person says, you know what? I volunteer to make the shitufei mavoot for everybody. So he takes a barrel of his own wine, and he puts it down and he says, Harezo lechol b'nei mavoi, this belongs to everybody in the mavoi. We all share it. I give it to everybody. Umizakeh lehen al yedei b'no v'ito agidolim. And he can be mizakeh, in other words, he transfers ownership of it to everybody who shares the mavoi, through his children, through his Hebrew servants, even through his wife. But he cannot use his children who are under bar mitzvah, his sons or daughters, and he cannot use his Eved Kena'ani, his non-Jewish slave, because Yadan ki yado, they don't have independent property. They don't have legal property. Whatever belongs to them belongs to him. You give something to your slave, it becomes yours. There's actually all these cases in Kiddushin, Masekhet Kiddushin. You give the Eved Kenani something, you're giving it to yourself. So you can't really give him a gift because everything he owns you own. So you can't give it to the Eved Kenani and say, receive this, I'm mizakeh, I want to give this to everybody, you be their representative, take this barrel of wine and make it belong to everybody in the mavoi. Why? Because when you hand it to him, you're handing it to yourself. You have to hand it to somebody else. You can take your adult son, your Jewish slave, or your wife even, and give it to her and say, receive this on behalf of everybody in the mavoi. She takes it, and now it belongs to everybody. So that way you don't have to go to each person in the mavoi and say, give me something for the shitufei mavoi, you give me something, you give me something. Instead you just say, you know what, I'm going to do it myself. I'll take my own barrel, I give it to everybody. Saves time and effort. The Gemara says, Amar Rav Yehuda says, shitufei mavoot tzarich la'agbiya min hakarka tefach. When you do this, the person you are mizakeh with has to lift it one tefach off the ground. That's what we do for kitubot, for any selling chametz. Whenever you make a kinyan acquisition, you have to lift it a tefach. Okay, so you lift it a tefach. So when you go to your wife and you say, wife, I want you to acquire this chavit, acquire this barrel for everybody in the mavoi, so it belongs to everyone, and it will unite all of us in our use of the mavoi. Your wife has to lift it a tefach off the ground. So Amar Rav Rava says, Hanei tarte milei sabei de Pumbedita amrinu. There were two teachings of the elders of Pumbedita. That was one of them. Okay? Chada ha. One of them was this, that somebody who is mizakeh or is zocheh in something, somebody who acquires something or transfers ownership, you have to lift it a tefach. Idach, the other one was hamikadesh im ta'am milo lugmav yatsa v'im lav lo yatsa. That somebody who makes kiddush on Shabbat, he has to drink a cheekful of the wine. If he doesn't fulfill the mitzvah. Amar Rav Chaviva. Rav Chaviva said, Hanami saveh de Pumbedita amrinu. Here's another teaching of the elders of Pumbedita. The Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, because Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Osin madura lachaya b'Shabbat. You can make a fire for a chaya. That doesn't mean a wild animal. It means a woman who gave birth. A woman who just gave birth and is feeling chilled, and therefore her life is in danger. You can make a fire for her to warm by on Shabbat. Savor mina lachaya in lecholelo b'imot geshamim in b'imot chamalo. They thought originally that was only for a woman who gave birth, not for a regular sick person. And they originally thought that it was only in the wintertime, but not in the summertime. Because why should you need it in the summertime? But Itmar, it was stated, Amar Rav Chia bar Avin Amar Shmuel. Rav Chia bar Avin said that Shmuel said, Hikiz dam benitztanen osin lo midura b'Shabbat. If a person gives bloodletting, and then he gets the chills, his life is in danger, we can make a fire for him to warm up, even on Shabbat. Va'afilo b'tkufat Tammuz, even in the middle of the summer. Even in the time of Tammuz, which is coming up, you're allowed to do it because it's subjective. You feel cold. It doesn't matter that it's warm outside. Amemar says, Hanami sambe de Pumbedita amrinu. This was also stated by the elders of Pumbedita. The Itmar, as it was stated, Ezohi Ashera Stam. how do you know an Asherah? How can you tell a tree that's worshipped by the idolaters? Amar Rav says, Kol shemishartei avodat gilulim shomrinota ve'ena to'amin miperotea. We turn to Pei Amud Aleph. Any tree that the idolaters guard, but they will not eat the fruit of the tree. So what do you say? It must be holy. It must be a holy tree. Ushmuel amar kegon da'amrei hanet mareh l'shichra de ben nitzrefei de shatule biyom chagam. That Shmuel says, when you hear the people say, these dates are for the beer of Ben Nitzrefeh. That was a certain idol worshipping place that they would drink the beer on the day of their holiday in that idolatrous temple. So that's how you know it's a holy tree. And lastly, Va'amru li saved pumbedita, and the elders of Pumbedita said, Hilcheta kevatei de Shmuel. The halacha follows Shmuel, that the way that we know that a tree is an idolatrous tree is not just that they don't eat from the fruit, but that they designate it. They actually say, we're going to take from these fruits for the beer for our idolatrous holiday. That's how you know that this is mukdash, so to speak. It is designated for idolatrous purposes.